When most people think of National Socialism, their minds leap immediately to the swastika, to Hitler, to the Holocaust. And because these images are very powerful, it's easy to stop there and to condemn them all as monsters and to turn away. But I'd like to invite you to see things from a higher place with me. If we only dismiss, we fail to understand. And if we fail to understand, we fail to see how our active denial as a society has facilitated their creation under new banners. National Socialism was never built on evil for evil's sake. It was built on ideas that felt to those inside them not only reasonable but righteous. And this is why it is so dangerous. Let's step inside the frame. Let's look at some of the beliefs that aren't usually spoken about that gives this worldview its psychological power over its followers. One of the core beliefs is that modern art, literature, and music are not expressions of freedom. They are signs of cultural collapse. For example, most modern movies coming out of Hollywood, pop music, modern art, almost anything on TV, they see as deliberate tools of degeneration. To them, art is meant to elevate, to bring order, to mirror the eternal. When art instead breaks down, mocks, confuses, they interpret it as an intentional attempt to corrode the spirit of the people, something they call demoralization. For instance, let's look at movie remakes like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs with Rachel Zellweger. To them, that's not just a retelling of a story by Disney trying to do a little cash grab. It's a mockery, and its intent is to erase history in the minds of modern youth so we don't know our own roots of culture. Many people, even outside of this kind of extremist thought, look at certain aspects of modern culture and they feel alienated. I've myself do this as well. They ask, where's the beauty? Where's the truth? Why does everything feel so ironic and shallow and cynical? It's a real human frustration. But in the National Socialist frame, it's weaponized into a story of sabotage which justifies their beliefs. Now, another theme for them is their obsession with health, fitness, and purity. So they see the human body as sacred, as the vessel of the nation itself. So junk food, pharmaceutical dependence, sedentary lifestyles to them aren't just bad habits. They're signs of civilizational rot, something that they detest in themselves if they do it, and they judge in others, and they enforce it onto each other. Again, who can't relate to that though? We all see the decline in health outcomes, the rise of chronic illness, the grip that corporations have pushing unhealthy products on us. There's this real desire to reconnect with vitality. But when that desire is hijacked by a political ideology, this idea of purity of blood, purity of body, purity of nation in you, if a NatSoc walks past someone in the street with excessive body mass, they usually are very judgmental. They're going to view them as weak and degenerate and a sign of decay of their country. Well, let's say that person was unfortunate enough to be born with a genetic condition inherited from their parents. There's no room in their mind for empathy or any form of connection there. Now, the third major belief I've noticed in these groups is perhaps one of the more mystical aspects. It's the idea that people are spiritually bound to the land of their ancestors. Blood and soil, I'm sure you've heard that phrase. They believe that your lineage is woven into the soil beneath your feet, and to be uprooted, forced into migration, or into urban anonymity is to be spiritually amputated. Modern life does uproot us. Many feel disconnected from nature, from home, from belonging. The ecological crisis itself reminds us that we have lost our bond with the earth. But instead of answering with an inclusive vision of healing the planet together, National Socialism answers with exclusivity. This land belongs to this blood and only this blood. which is funny when you really think about it. I mean, look at nations like USA or Australia. We are clearly immigrants at some point of time coming from Europe to land here on this soil. Yes, our modern ancestors did build these nations from nothing, and that in itself is not nothing. But to say that we are bound to this soil after being here only a couple of hundred years is perhaps a little bit out of place. It is more understandable for areas like England or Ireland or Scandinavian nations. Another belief is that capitalism and consumerism, they're soul destroying forces. So they see the endless chase for money, the commodification of life, the reduction of meaning to transactions. They reject it. They say a life of honor, sacrifice, and beauty is worth more than a life of wealth. This strikes a chord. Many people today feel crushed by consumerism, by the emptiness of materialism. But instead of imagining a new ethic of shared humanity, NatSoc, they twist this into a narrative of blame, saying that consumerism is not just an extension of human behavior and nature, but it's a plot by an enemy to destroy their people's spirits. Now, obviously, these things are very justifying in their minds. You can start to see that. And that leads me to the next point: heroic death, martyrdom. Sacrifice to NatSoc is central to their core beliefs. They believe that to die in service of the nation is the very highest honor, and that this kind of death confers a kind of immortality, or at the least, it's a moral obligation to them. And through this, even suffering or loss is kind of reframed as a victory. This is a very powerful psychology. Human beings have always needed stories of sacrifice to make sense of mortality. It's a kind of escape from the fear of it. Every culture has this to some degree, but when that sacrifice is claimed for the exclusivity of one group, it becomes a story that justifies war and atrocity. It also creates fuel to turn yourself into fodder, as people within these groups kind of egg each other on to go further and further, with greater sacrifices and greater impacts being celebrated within their circles. Like the New Zealand shooter, for example, he's now got a new label of Saint Tarrant. I'm honestly quite worried about this. A lot of young men are going to go out there and do some pretty extreme stuff, I reckon, just with this mentality. I'd like to propose to any of the NatSoc listening now. There is no greater sacrifice, more noble, than the surrender to a life that lifts others up or builds something that heals rather than destroys. I've heard you complain about the destruction of your people and the loss of breeding stock. But have you actually questioned why birth rates are declining? And what the hell have you actually done to contribute in a more positive direction towards it? If people can't afford homes to live in, they can't afford food prices. If young people lack direction, they don't know what career to invest into to create a stable life for themselves. There are a lot of potentials right now. There's a lot of jobs or careers or new businesses that you can create that actually directly help these families to get a solid position in the world. If you want to see more children being born of your race, of your people, why not focus on that? Why are you just waiting for a movement to take power based on an idea of destruction? A dream that in all likelihood is never gonna come. So let's move on to the next belief, the next way they see things. They also believe that movements like feminism, LGBTQ plus rights, and racial integration, they're not natural evolutions of human society, but they are orchestrated campaigns to weaken civilization. To them, these aren't just cultural shifts, they're evidence of a coordinated attack. There's a lot changing right now. I'm sure you can agree, and it seems to be getting more and more rapid. And it leaves people feeling unable to orientate themselves. It's a real disorientation. But the National Socialist lens transforms disorientation into paranoia. into belief that behind every shift is an enemy pulling strings. See, there is evidences like if you look at, for instance, the cultural Marxists that have infiltrated our universities, they seem to be almost manufacturing gay people and looking at ways to destroy family units. I'm sure that's not their motivation. This is just how it's seen, you see. But I can't really argue against it. I can't really counter it. I can only acknowledge this to be true, even if it is a distortion. These people didn't invent same sex attraction, it's a part of human nature. And no matter how much you want to dismiss this as unnatural, it still prevails in all of history. In any real tradition of human society, even the ones living out in the forests, isolated from the world, you still see instances of this occurring. And at some point, you're just going to have to sit with that. Now, this is a lesser known element that many National Socialists are actually rejecting Christianity outright. They see it as a foreign import. It's Semitic in its origin, weakening the warrior spirit of Europe with its values of meekness and forgiveness. So, what they're actually doing is revitalizing old paganism, Norse mythology, and occult traditions, which they have imagined as more authentically Aryan. Here we see something really interesting. We've got a hunger for our roots, for myth, for spiritual frameworks that feel alive. And this hunger, it's really human. Never mind that as Jewish as Jesus may have been, Christianity has still been the source and foundation of some of the greatest architecture, paintings, music, and literature in Western history. These aren't just the products of white people because of our natures. These are beauty inspired by the artists, captured by a vision of the heart that religion has shown them about themselves. Christianity didn't invent meekness or tolerance. What it did was it told the world that that part of themselves wasn't something to be ashamed about, that it was, in fact, a virtue, and that there is a time and a place to express it. For example, during the period we fondly know as the Renaissance. Now, moving on to another thing that I've learnt about NatSoc in the modern world, what they really believe, what they see, how they see things, is they deeply believe that societies thrive not under democracy, but under a guiding hand of a strong leader. A leader who embodies the will of the people and acts without hesitation. Democracy to them is chaos, and pure leadership is order. And here we get to it. Why do they follow Hitler? See, Hitler represents a figure who embodies the collective will of their in-group. In the National Socialist worldview, moral right isn't an abstract principle. It's enacted through strength, decisiveness, and leadership. Hitler is perceived as someone who acts without compromise to preserve what they see as the purity and destiny of the Volk. Worshipping him is, in their eyes, affirming the moral correctness of prioritizing the group over the individual, duty over sentiment. Hitler allows adherents to externalize their moral judgment rather than take responsibility for it. They don't have to wrestle with ethical ambiguity themselves. They can simply align with his example, seeing him as the embodiment of moral certainty. To worship Hitler is to adopt a moral framework that feels absolute, externally sanctioned, and historically verified. I would suggest, actually, I would suggest studying up on the history of Germany leading up to World War II. If you really want to understand where a lot of them are coming from and why they're so conspiracy minded, because there is a lot of room for alternative views on this movement. His actions, from another light, could be justified in some minds because of the threat of elements like Bolshevism threatening Germany with complete collapse, the nature of their government pre Hitler's rise to power, which was highly corrupt, and the economic situation the Germans found themselves in. Now, finally, the last thing, They believe that society is already doomed to collapse and that this collapse is not only inevitable, but it's necessary. They frame themselves as the vanguard of a coming rebirth, strong men who will rebuild from the ashes. There is a bit of a human truth here. Many sense that our civilization is fragile, that collapse is possible. The desire to be part of renewal, to rise again, is deeply compelling. But let me ask you a question. Why do we need the destruction in order to do that? Why can't we just start building now? Why can't we just build up and save ourselves the collapse? Why the destruction first? Now, finally, the last thing, they believe that society is already doomed to collapse and that this collapse is not only inevitable, but it's necessary. So, why do we go through all this? Why take the time to understand ideas that we are naturally recoiling from rather than just condemning it all? The answer lies in the nature of evil itself. The most dangerous evil is not the villain who knows he's evil. It's the man or the movement that believes with absolute certainty that they are acting in pure righteousness, even as they're committing acts of unspeakable harm. The National Socialists don't see themselves as monsters. In their eyes, they're saviors, they're martyrs, they're guardians of civilization. And it's precisely this conviction of moral rectitude that enables them to commit horrors. It's not a story confined in history books. It's a pattern that we're seeing again and again across many ideological spectrums. In the fervor of religious extremists, in the rigidity of political absolutists, and in any system that equates personal or collective purity with moral rightness. Different flags, different symbols, different slogans. But the underlying mechanism is the same. Righteousness becomes a weapon. Conviction becomes a justification. The belief that I am good, therefore whatever I do must also be good. It's the poison that disguises evil as virtue. And this is what makes it so insidious. It hides in plain sight, and it's seductive to those who long for certainty, for belonging, for purpose. Understanding this does not mean agreement. It does not mean endorsement. It means just simply seeing clearly. Because when we refuse to look, when we mock, when we suppress, when we exile these perspectives, we only make the shadows darker and more dangerous and more explosive. But when we bring them into the light, when we acknowledge them, when we have clarity and discernment, we begin to see what's true, what's distorted, and what's just false. This is a lesson not only about others, but about ourselves. The same mechanism that allows someone to justify destruction in the name of righteousness lives within every rigid ideology. It lives wherever purity, certainty, or dogma replaces humility, curiosity, and dialogue. The moment these impulses crystallize against the other, they become indistinguishable from the forces we claim to oppose. So the question for us today is a profound one. What would myth look like if it no longer justified war, conquest, or collapse? What if our stories called humanity towards transcendence, towards the creation of a future, not for some, but for all? What if the highest ideal was not smiting enemies, but outgrowing the very need for enemies? Neo-Nazism, religious fanaticism, extreme ideology, conviction, they are not alien forces. They are mirrors, and they reveal the shadow of moral certainty, the dangers of righteousness untempered by reflection, and the human tendency to turn devotion into destruction. And until we recognize this pattern, both in the world around us and within ourselves, the cycle of violence is going to persist. Understanding this, seeing it for what it is not a concession. It's a vigilance. And it is the first step towards preventing the shadow from consuming us all. Thank you for watching. This has been part two. I hope you found it enlightening, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Am I right or am I wrong? Let me know in the comments.